That was just sound check. That doesn't mean we're ready to start.
Is it really 10:35? Yes. Wow, we're 5 minutes late.
And it is time to start, in fact. Welcome, everyone, to Theology, Science, and Culture, a conversation with Katharine Jefferts Schori. I am Anthony Baker. I am the Systematic Theology Professor here at Seminary of the Southwest.
And I am Scott Vadersay, the Christian Ethics and Moral Theology Professor here at the seminary.
This event this morning is a joint effort of the Theology Studio and the Seminary of the Southwest. Seminary is celebrating 60 years, as most of you know. The Theology Studio is not quite a year old. If you are here, we are welcoming a live streaming audience as well. So thank you for being with us. If you are either here in the audience with us or live streaming, you can send questions into us through a very technologically savvy relay system that we worked out. You can send these in through Twitter and use the hashtag SSW60. When you do that, and those will show up. We'll get to as many of those questions as we can. And if it seems when we make space for audience questions, if it seems like we keep calling on the same person, that's because those questions are feeding in through one person who is going over them. So it's not simply that Susanna Brousseau here is the only person that we're interested in calling on. She's keeping an eye on that Twitter feed. And if you've submitted questions by note card as well, the old-fashioned way, she's got those as well. If the Theology Studio is a new term for you, you can find out what you need to know about us at theologystudio.org. The Most Reverend Katharine Jefferts Schori holds an MDiv from the Church Divinity School of the Pacific, also a PhD in Oceanography from Oregon State University. She is the author of Wing and a Prayer, A Message of Faith and Hope, and also more recently, The Heartbeat of God, Finding the Sacred in the Middle of Everything. And she is the 26th presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. We are fortunate and very pleased to have her with us here talking with us this hour. So thank you very much, Bishop Katharine, for being here.
We have had the chance to have a bit of conversation with you over the last day and a half here at the seminary, and we've had an opportunity for a number of questions to emerge about the Episcopal Church, leadership, your leadership of the denomination. What we hope to do this morning then is to focus us in a more sort of distinctly theological direction. What we try to do when we have interviews and podcasts of the Theology Studio is to get a bead on what's happening in theological conversation and try to be a forum for exploring those things. So we're going to bring some of that emphasis into today's conversation, partly just so you don't end up answering the same questions you've already had to answer at the previous events. So to get us started in that direction, I just wanted to ask, who are the theologians who you have read, either in your studies or more recently, who have been most influential for you?
I think the most influential theologians I've read have been theologians of liberation from a variety of perspectives. When I was doing my seminary training, we didn't read the Herr Professor Doctors so much as we read the current range of Latin American liberation theologians and feminist liberation theologians, Asian liberation theologians, black liberation theologians. I think the growing edge in all of that is other margins of the human reality that are seeking liberation. I'm not adept in it, but I know that GLBT liberation is a significant voice in that conversation now. I think there is a growing place for understanding theologies of liberation of creation It's not, that phrase isn't often used, but I think that's a voice that needs human beings to speak for it. I think there's also been a growing edge in the church for lay liberation, baptismal vocation liberation. That is an important part of the conversation.
Yeah. Your mention of creation liberation calls to mind Romans 8, right? The groaning of creation waiting for its deliverance.
Right.
And so it sort of ties in nicely, though I hadn't thought of a creation liberation theology, right? But that sort of logic works. At the American Academy of Religion meeting a couple weeks ago, I heard a really interesting paper on Palestinian liberation theology. And one of the things they were pointing out is that Palestinian liberation theology is different from some of the Latin American liberation theologies because it is not primarily economic, right? So it's not driven by a certain conception of class or economy, but a certain kind of political marginalization. But it was fascinating to see how that language and that paradigm was arising there as well.
And both obviously are influenced or nested in the issues of land. Who owns this land? Who can live on this land and use its resources? And who is going to use those resources in fruitful ways?
So we're here on the campus of a theological seminary, right? And both faculty and students are sort of doing the work that we do in the hopes that poring over the texts of the Gospels, of commentaries, poring over the texts of James Cone or Thomas Aquinas, that's important work. We sort of, we have this sort of time in this space in which this is what we do, and we do it, I think, with the sort of hope and the confidence that this matters for the church. Does it?
No. I said to the students, I think yesterday morning, that this is an enormous privilege to have this time and space to focus so deeply. It won't come again, at least not in this kind of extent. That's what sabbaticals are for, but they're too short. The
Doug,
leisure,
could you maybe talk with the presiding bishop about that issue?
When I get my spot.
the leisure and privilege to study and think. The rabbis have said that for millennia. You are doing work on behalf of the whole church that the whole church doesn't always have time to do.
Where do you see the future of seminary education? I know you touched on this a little bit last night, but we may have some folks here who didn't hear about that. Obviously, we're in a time of revisioning structures throughout the Episcopal Church. How do you see seminaries sort of developing and moving forward in terms of where the church needs to be going?
I think we need this kind of formation, and we will continue to need it. How we're going to resource it, I think, is the biggest question right now. If there's a clear vision of how to do it more effectively, I think the resources will arrive. It's a matter of vision and focus and telling the story effectively, and then the resources are undoubtedly there. We need well-grounded, thoughtful leaders in the church who can equip others to do the same kind of work. We need leaders who can think ecumenically and interreligiously, who can think in conversation with a world that may not claim a particular faith tradition, but be asking deep spiritual questions. We touched on this last night, too, in terms of language. What language do we use? That's maybe one of the most challenging parts. When you're rooted in a place that thinks in a particular idiom, in particular argot and jargon, how do you translate that into communities that are asking similar questions but using vastly different language? I think that translation and literal moving across, building a bridge to another culture, to be able to have a much richer conversation. I think that's a piece of what seminaries could be doing more effectively.
Is there a role, you think, for theological thinking, theological reflection outside the church in culture, in societies, in politics? I mean, how does is theological conversations limited to the sphere of the church, and if not, how might we think about that?
Well, is the church not out there? I think some of the most creative theological conversations I know about and I've been privy to take place in secular settings or in different traditions settings, where we get out of our comfortable language, where we have to stretch to communicate in another community. Theology at work, the people who go and do theology on tap, who sit in bars and invite people to enter into conversation about the deep questions they have. If we're not out there, we're not doing our job. But there has to be an ability to go back and forth.
So in that sense, maybe there's a sort of public role that's still sort of theological conversation, but it's by the folks that it invites. It is a way of extending those conversations into reflections on, say, not sort of Christology defined in the classroom, but let's think about the person and work of Christ as it is a question that you might ask in your vocational space, coming out of your life in your setting.
Or even more broadly, I'll give you an example. I sit on the board of the National Academy of Sciences as a supposed citizen representative. The questions that are asked in that venue are about value. What values do you bring to decision making and to policy making? And they're deeply informed by the people's perspectives that grow out of their understanding of what is more important than themselves, how they're in relationship to something, someone beyond their own self-interest. That's that specific language.
Right, because we're trying to explore what it means to be human with one another, and we have a long tradition of reflection on what it means to be human and what it looks like to flourish as human beings, and it seems to me one of the places where culturally we can contribute to that conversation is to challenge certain descriptions of the human that are extremely thin. So I'm thinking, for instance, of a lot of our economic conversations where human beings are construed as self-interested, rational choosers. And so we build economic theory and then we build economic policy on this construal of what it is to be a human being. And of course, then once you've built a policy on this construal, you then need to reproduce exactly that kind of person in order for the policy to work, right? So we actually need to be forming self-interested, rational choosers. How might the church's discourse about what it means to be human, or our discourse about how we think about community and interrelatedness, how might that help us respond and contribute to a wider public conversation about the recent financial crisis that we're still trying to bounce back from? What do we have that arises out of our tradition that can contribute something fresh to the conversation there?
Pragmatically, I think congregations often do a good job of supporting people who are unemployed or underemployed, who are looking for work. I've seen some remarkably effective ministries that help people improve their skills in the job search process. They also often begin to ask people about their value systems. begin to open up the larger economic questions about why they're pursuing the kind of work they're pursuing, or what their dream is, to be present in the community in a way that builds up the community and provides a living. Those are vocational questions, and they are deeply impacted by what kind of a community you're in search of. There's a way to invite the larger community into conversations like that and to begin to have a significant impact.
Yeah. I really like what you said about the ways that we come to see how we make a living while contributing to the good of the community, because too often those things are just separated, right? So we make a living over here, and then over here we do something good for the community. Whereas, right, at its best, economic life is all about participating in a kind of mutuality that's beneficial to the community. We're just not used to thinking of it that way.
And again, there's some of that theological reflection, public theological reflection built into that. So yes, what a church can offer maybe is job training, but job training that's ready to think with people about vocational matters. Think about what does it mean to be human? What is the good life? What is the common good that all of our efforts can contribute to? Raising those questions in that sort of way. It may seem a very small contribution, because it may seem like, well, actually, folks need jobs and they need the skills, and that's the primary thing. But if I'm hearing you right, then you're saying that this is as small as it is, that's still something we can offer, something that the church can offer.
And I think it has a wider impact than we recognize. You look at some of the development work in the third world, supposedly third world, which is present in the United States as well. It is about helping people find dignity in their job, in their work, by earning enough to have a decent standard of living, water and shelter and food and a place for your children. But what kind of work is reasonable? What kind of work is valuable? What kind of work contributes not just to your own dignity, but to the well-being and flourishing of the community?
Thinking still about how theology contributes to a wider public conversation, you've mentioned over the course of the last couple of days your experience and your work as a scientist and that background. I'm wondering about how theology participates in that conversation with science, and also a sort of cultural conversation about how we perceive science, because it strikes me that we are at a time where one of our dangers is a kind of scientific positivism, where science is the only place where truth comes from, right? Truth equals facts, and science gives us facts, and therefore, theological reasoning or poetic knowing gets dismissed. But then there's another side where science itself gets relativized. So science becomes, well, that's just one more set of opinions. And I was noticing this in a recent news report on climate change, where you can have a broad scientific consensus on something like climate change, but there are still those who can simply dismiss it as, well, that's just sort of one opinion among others. So theologically, I guess my question is, how do we find a way between this sort of positivism that gives science all the power and the only real answers, and a kind of relativism that doesn't allow us to build the right kind of consensus and rely on scientific knowledge to help our public conversation go forward?
I think a piece of it is about basic education, helping people in the church and beyond the church in the larger society understand that theory means something rather different than the popular construct, and myth means something rather different than the popular construct. Theory is the best consensus of scientists about how things work. It's something that's very hard to disprove. Myth is a story about origins that carries enormously deep meaning, that helps to illuminate a way of living that is constructive. The charges that are often made by people of faith and scientists against the other is that, well, that's just a myth, or that's just a theory, without understanding the deep truth that is present in both.
Not even using those words properly in that sense.
Right, right. But the caricature that goes along with that way of using the words, it's dismissive. It's not vulnerable enough to the truth that is present in another way of looking at the world. And together, those particular ways of seeing the world give one a much deeper ability to trust what you see and what you experience.
Yeah. And it seems like, for instance, in debates within Texas high school curriculum committees, right, where it's a question of do you put Darwinism and creationism as two theories side by side, or how do you do that? And just describing it the way you described it suggests that there's a sort of categorical error at work there. Seeing them as two of the same kinds of anything is the wrong way of looking at it, because then you've basically said whatever kind of thing both of these things are, that's where truth is found, and it's nowhere else.
Let's take a second and see if there are some audience questions.
There are.
There are.
Good morning, Bishop Katharine. This is a two-part question coming to you from a member of our live studio audience. And the question is, can God change? And is there a problem in denying divine immutability? Softball question.
Do we see evidence that God has changed when we read the Bible? Would there be a problem in denying the ability of God or our perception of God to change? I want to go underneath that question a lot deeper. Our experience of God if we're not talking about the person of Jesus, our experience, who does change, he changes his mind about the woman with the daughter who's ill, which I think is a very important awareness. If we're talking about the presence of God everywhere, at all times, our perception of that can always only be extremely limited. And again, I have to use the non-personal for this. I don't know any other way to get at it. If we understand God as the force of drawing greater being into existence, drawing creation into more whole existence, that force presumably does not change, but our perception of what is being drawn into existence changes.
Did we get to the second part of that question? Can God change, and what was the other?
Is there a problem with
Is there a problem with
denying
the other?
immutability?
Right. Yeah. So in that sense, there is something unchanging about God, and yet our experience of the divine is always going to be change. It's always going to be newness and novelty. It's that sort of through the Old Testament language especially, that sort of the constancy of God's faithfulness up against, the blessings of God are new every morning. So God for us is new every morning. What does that say about the divine being? Well, right, good question. Yeah. So changing tracks slightly. There has been, and you may have heard, a bit of a kerfuffle in the Synod of the Church of England recently. I don't know if you keep up on this, but
A kerfuffle.
yes,
Nicely put.
yes. Well, it's British, right?
It's British.
Right.
It's about something being in a twist, I think.
Yes. Right. So the Synod of the Church of England recently voted down the amendment that would allow women to become bishops, women to be consecrated as bishops. I'm assuming that you are in favor of the consecration of women as bishops. I don't want to put myself out there too much.
It would be odd not to.
Yeah. Okay. Thank my research assistant for getting that one. An article in the New Yorker about this suggested that that there is a movement and process that may bring that decision into a violation of the Workplace Discrimination Act in England. And also, at the same time, this article mentioned that the Prime Minister was active in this conversation, telling the church that it's time to get on with it and move ahead with this act. What I wonder about that, though, is the sort of the dominant voice in favor of that act, in favor of the consecration of women as bishops, in favor of ordination of women throughout the Anglican Communion, seems to be mostly a secular argument. Seems to be mostly the sort of time to get on with it, catch up, catch up to the culture. I wonder if there may be theological arguments that could be as persuasive as the secular ones, or maybe even more so, persuasive in terms of people within the Anglican churches, persuasive in terms of the ecumenical conversations with denominations and church bodies who have theological arguments against ordination of women, consecration of women. So, in those sense, often you have a sort of theological argument that's met with a secular argument, and two sides aren't actually having the conversation. Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, for instance, are generally very good about building theological arguments, and those conversations tend to miss each other. So I'm just wondering, what are some theological arguments in favor of either ordination of women, consecration of women that you find, consecration of women as bishops that you find persuasive?
I think there are two difficulties in England right now. One is that it is an established church, and therefore they must expect to hear from the wider culture. If they're not legally established, the issues are rather different. The theological question is a timing error, I believe. Once women were admitted to the priesthood, it's not a question. There's not a categorical difference between ordaining women as bishops and ordaining them as priests. I think that's a false distinction. That's why the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox resist doing either. They don't say you can ordain them as priests but not as bishops. It's just a fundamental mistake.
How has this mistake gained traction? I mean, because I think you're exactly right. The theology of ordination wouldn't really allow us to make that sort of distinction. Just from your perspective in the Church of England, why has this category of mistake sort of continued for as long as it has?
It's our difficulty with change, and I think it's a human difficulty with change. It's prejudice. You have to say that that's a significant part of this. When I was in England right before Lambeth in 2008, I was in the Diocese of Salisbury, visiting there, together with all of the Sudanese bishops. It was a wonderful experience. But I spoke to a congregational gathering, not unlike this one day, And a man came up to me afterward and he said, well, you know, we just can't imagine having to take orders from a woman. And I said, well, you know, you do in your public life, you do in your business, in the business world, and that's not the fundamental job of the bishop anyway, to give orders. And
Right.
and the head of your church has been a woman for many decades, and it has not seemed to be a problem. The Queen of England is head of the Church of England. It's a prejudice at its root.
Right. So the whatever sort of strange theology that justifies it is sort of driven by something else.
And we're not immune from that.
Right.
One of the real challenges, obviously, that you have faced since becoming presiding bishop is in keeping the Episcopal Church together, keeping unity of some sort within the body, and I have understood that sort of theologically has to do with you know, the one body, you know, one hope, one faith, one baptism. That the unity of the church is not just a sort of organization of organizational importance, but it's a theological importance. Is that you know, one of the difficulties of this space, it seems to me, in the Episcopal Church or in the life of the Anglican Communion is we have structures that allow us to pursue that kind of unity in a diocesan level and at a provincial level, but we're still sort of scrambling to think together about what it might mean to pursue that kind of unity at a communion-wide level. Is that something? Is that ecclesiology important to you? Is sort of the ecclesiological unity beyond the provincial level important? And if it is at some level, then what do you see as the sort of the way forward? How do we try to make that a reality?
I think it is essential. It's an intrinsic part of what it means to be in fellowship and koinonia, in communion together. We are all enriched by the diversity of God's creation, including fellow Anglicans. When a part of the body departs, we are diminished. That said, my sense of the wider communion is of increasing health and relationship, and deeper relationship. There are more partnerships between dioceses and congregations and provinces of the communion today than there were 10 years ago. We've had to have hard conversations, and we're beginning to learn how to do that. The Indaba work, continuing Indaba, the Bible in the Life of the Church project, the networks of the Anglican Communion are becoming more and more significant, and that's where communion gets lived out. Not in throwing, you know, verbal bombs at one another, of which there's been too much. It is in the meeting, in the literal, physical sitting down together to have conversation, that communion begins to grow and develop and have real life. The Anglican Consultative Council that met in Auckland in late October and early November was a remarkable example of that. Everybody was there except Uganda, who had reportedly forgotten to elect their members last summer. Everybody else showed up. Some had visa problems, and individuals didn't get there. There were some challenging conversations, but there was not the level of anger that we saw 3 years ago and 6 years ago. People understand at a deeper level what the differences are, but they've receded behind the forefront view of what's important that we can be and do together. And it is about the life of God's people and God's creation.
So one thing I'm hearing in that then is that the ecclesiology of the church as one body with many members, and understanding that as Catholic in the sense of the universal or the whole, that's lived out through conversation on the ground more so than some sort of determination to create a structure at the top that makes sure the body stays as one. Is that right? So in a way, I'm asking about the difference between making sure those conversations are happening and something like a covenant that at least for some is experienced as kind of a top-down move to enforce something rather than invite something.
It's another example of a kind of liberation theology. Honoring the context and the way in which the gospel is heard and spoken in a particular place, and what is liberating about that in Nigeria, and what is liberating about that in Polynesia, when they enter into conversation with each other in a way that can honor the way that God is at work in different cultures and contexts, something much deeper grows than a rule that comes from the top, which does not give life in the same way.
Just to press on that idea a bit, it would seem if that is true globally, that some sort of analogy ought to hold nationally, if you see what I mean.
Church-wide?
Yes, within the Episcopal Church. So, I mean, couldn't you make the argument that the authority structure holding the diocese together as a province needs to not be top down, but needs to be sort of grassroots diocese making decisions to be in communion and be in conversation with one another.
Isn't that what General Convention is? It's not top down. It's grassroots. It is the people coming together to say this is what we need as a body to live together in community.
That makes sense. So that the organizational structures are maybe provincially and internationally remain important, but not as a sort of bureaucratic move to insist on unity, but as a grassroots space for here's General Convention is what we call it when the diocese gather and form a church. Maybe the Anglican Consultative Council and Lambeth and the primates meeting are what we call the spaces when the provincial churches gather and be as a body in conversation with one another.
Are there ways to encourage those intra-diocesan conversations in between General Convention? I'm sure there are. But how do we nurture those in a way that we at least create space to move beyond some of the polarization that's present?
Again, I think it happens when people sit down together. There's the polarization that infects our larger culture has infected the church. It's always been a two-way street. The reality is that when some members of a body believe they have the whole truth in themselves, there's less willingness to enter into dialogue, to be vulnerable to the other voices in the body. If a member, and I want to use that kind of language rather than individuals or dioceses or identifiable pieces, if a member believes that the truth that member knows requires separation, there's not much that the other members can do. We don't believe in autonomy, cutting oneself off as Christians. But the body doesn't have a great ability to, other than to continue to reach out to prevent it. It's the tragedy of our human limitation. It can also be the blessing, Because if we could prevent abused women from leaving abusive relationships, we would do a great deal of evil. It's a part of the finitude in which we exist.
The need to separate from time to time.
Both the inability to prevent it, it brings both curse and blessing.
Some of the comments you made last night, I think, might be interesting in that regard. Building an analogy from your work as an oceanographer, seeing ocean as a complex system and seeing the parts moving together, and seeing this sort of complex dynamic, you know, in the life of an ecosystem. Do you think that has, in some sense, informed how you look at church structure and how you look at the life of the church? It was that sort of systemic, that sort of systemic view, sort of broad view of a kind of complex organic unity.
Absolutely. Ocean systems are often studied on the basis of water masses, like the water mass in the Gulf of Mexico. There are currents that largely limit that. It has interaction at its edges with other water masses. It might be like the Episcopal Church and the Methodist Church. There's often a great deal of productivity at those marginal interactions. You can define a water mass by its salinity and temperature, and it has a signature that's particular to that water mass. The creatures that live in that water mass are often different than the creatures that live in another water mass. Water mass as a system is pretty robust. It's got a creative inner life. There's more creativity often at the edges, at the margins. There's often also more chaos, more turbulence at the margins, where it's interacting with another water mass. And that's a source of creativity.
So we should be paying attention to where the headwaters of the Episcopal Church meet with the backwaters of the I may have lost the metaphor in this area.
There's no primacy of place in different water masses. There's no, you can't define an origin and an outlet in water masses the way you can with rivers. They tend to be circulating, which makes it easy to stay in the middle and never interact with anybody else.
Let it all just spin around you.
Yeah.
But the interesting life goes on at the margins, which is where Jesus always was. He was at the margins of his society.
Right, which says something to us both about the Episcopal Church and the Methodists, but also about how we stand in relation to Islam, or how we stand in relation to a secular culture, all of which form different kinds of edges that we either negotiate or ignore.
That's what pontifical ministry is about, bridge building. That's what it means.
Yeah.
And that's basically what
So
all
to pontificate is to
No,
build a bridge.
No. It is, but
It
It would
it's
involve a
useless
redefinition
one.
of how
A
we've
useless
thought
one.
of that.
Yeah.
Maybe we could hear some more audience questions.
This one comes to you from our Twitter feed. How would you describe what is occurring in our liturgy to someone from a non-liturgical tradition?
Which liturgy?
They didn't specify.
Ask Twitter.
All religious traditions have some kind of liturgy, have some kind of form, because they're repetitive, they're repeated. So I think it's a matter of translating what's going on at different pieces in whatever the worship service looks like. I had to lean over and ask somebody in chapel this morning what RI 42 meant. because I didn't recognize that abbreviation as the right one. So translation has to happen at all sorts of different levels. It's a matter, I think it's an honest conversation about what you think is happening at this point in the liturgy. We're offering praise to God through our bodies, through our full presence, singing, offering prayers. That might get you into some wonderful conversations about what prayer is and how people pray in a variety of ways. That's how I would start, anyway.
Want to take a second? Question?
Sure. Among the headlines that have greeted you during your tenure is, quote, "Presiding bishop believes Jesus is not the only way," end quote. Is John 14:6, which is, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me," true?
Yes, it's true. And yes, God is at work in ways that we don't understand, which is the other side of that. You know, John's community wrote that at a time when they were having a very hard time with their edges, with their interactions on the edge. Do you see God at work in the life of Mahatma Gandhi? Do you see God's Spirit at work in the life of Thich Nhat Hanh? Neither of them would claim Jesus as his route to the divine. Yet, we see evidence of the divine at work in their lives. What's going on? I think that's a wonderful invitation into a deeper conversation.
And if I hear what you're saying, part of it is that the question needs to become a Trinitarian question and not just a Christological question, right? So we have to. It is a Christological question, but it's also a question of Father and Spirit and how Spirit's at work in ways that are not negating the centrality of Christ, but also sort of respect the fullness of the work of the Trinity. Is that?
Yeah.
Should we, at the same time, can that sort of reflection inform our Christology? I mean, one way to approach that, it seems, would be to say, let's talk about what it means to enter into relationship with the Father through Christ. It may, that may be a sort of a more complex proposition than on the surface it seems. I mean, is that an approach to sort of let's deal with some of the Christological implications of the question and think creatively about those issues?
Absolutely. Ronner tried with anonymous Christians. I've never found that terribly helpful. I don't think it goes far enough. There have to be ways of understanding the cosmic Christ, present everywhere, even when people are unable to or name or perceive Christ. Christ is the Word present, even if the Word doesn't take that form.
Maybe something more in lines with Teilhard de Chardin and the cosmic Christ image. It seems one of the challenges of with Rana and the anonymous Christians is that may not sort of feel like a compliment to Mahatma Gandhi.
Exactly.
Oh, I'm what?
Yeah.
Right?
Right. Well, another way into that is the way that Barth does it, right? Because for Barth, Christ's redemptive work is universally redemptive, right? And so there's a strong sort of noetic thing going on, right? The difference is whether you know it, not whether it's already impacted the world, and by that he means the whole world. And so when he has that brief section on secular parables of the kingdom and the dogmatics, the secular parables can arise from places that are not explicitly naming Christ as present, and yet Barth can understand those as bearing witness to Christ's work, because Christ's work has already actually done transformative work within the creation. So whether it's Rana or Barth, I mean, there are a number of ways to come at this, but it seems like that's that's one of the ways that the church, certainly over the last 100 years, has tried to figure out that sort of edge. How do we maintain the centrality of Christ without sort of denying the significance of Christ within our tradition, but also name the sort of engagements we have at the edge, wherein we actually encounter the presence of God at work, and we need a way of being able to name both of those things.
The challenge I think that we have to wrestle with all the time is the way in which that verse is used as a way to cut off the conversation. And that's I think the tragedy. That is not Christ-like. To say that if you cannot claim this verse, you're outside the realm of God's redemption.
Because that sort of comes around comes around all the way around to say, and so your salvation depends upon some sort of human act of acknowledgement and knowledge and acknowledgement.
No longer grace.
It's no longer grace, right? Yeah, Suzanne. Another audience question.
Yes. Another Twitter question. Without saying time will tell, how will the new Archbishop change Episcopal theology?
I already told you what you can't answer. We should have done that. We should have started that way.
right? Without answering this way.
Little e.
I just read the questions as they come in, guys.
Little
You do it
e
quite well.
theology or big E theology? Episcopal with a capital E or a small e?
Well, it's a small e, but this person might have been in a hurry.
It's Twitter. There's probably no vowels in it anyway.
Yeah.
Big E.
Oh.
I've been updated. It's a big E.
Okay. Oh. The Archbishop-elect has some experience of us. He was at General Convention in 2009 in Anaheim. He saw how we work. He participated in the sense of observing our legislative work and committee work. And he spent the meeting with the bishops last March, the whole meeting. He was present with us. He's got a number of relationships already with people in this church. So I think he's going to bring a different perspective than the current Archbishop brought, at least at the beginning of his tenure. Just being here and having conversations again, I'm big on that, has got a significant, is going to make a significant difference in how the conversation goes forward. He also brings an experience of the world that is radically different from the current Archbishop. He's worked in business. He's worked in Africa, not as an academic. He has been present in the Church of England in different ways than the current Archbishop has. He brings a different constellation of gifts and relationships, and that's going to impact his experience of and conversation with Episcopal churches and with our theology. He's also been much clearer at the beginning of his, even before his tenure, about some hot button issues, which I think is a sign of a different kind of leadership. And I think that's going to have an impact on our conversations as churches and as a member of the communion.
And when you say a different kind of leadership, do you think, do you see it as a positive thing that sort of stating positions right up front? Do you think that's going to be helpful?
I think his ability to state his position about the women bishops question in England right now was helpful. It was a defining characteristic. He was much more reticent in defining his position about same-sex unions and gay marriage, which seems appropriate. But he's been more self-defining in relationship to his role than the current Archbishop was at the beginning.
Final question, and this is maybe the toughest one we've got in the notebook, so I hope you're ready. what is the best movie that you've seen all year? It's a tough one, I told you.
It's a tough one because I almost never see any.
Or book that you've read in your sort of fields or outside of them.
Well, I'm reading a remarkable one right now by Winston Halapua, who's the Archbishop of Polynesia, Primate of Polynesia, about Moana theology. Moana is the Polynesian word for ocean.
How did you come by such a book?
It was a gift. It was a gift. It was. He wrote it, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. It's a small book, but he's exploring what ocean means in Polynesian culture and theological understandings of that have blessed the way in which the church in Polynesia has grown and developed. And a lot of it has to do with, you may or may not, and our viewers may or may not know about the settlement of Polynesia. The first Polynesians came from Taiwan, the area that is now Taiwan in Southeast Asia, and migrated into the Pacific Ocean by sea. They were remarkable navigators and sailors, intrepid folk. They went on large canoes with a number of people to settle islands. They steered by the stars and by the water and what they saw in the ocean. There's a lot here about pilgrimage. They have a much more holistic understanding of what it means to be a member of a community than most North Americans do, particularly in relationship to the sea and the rest of creation. So I think it's going to continue to resonate with me.
Amazing. I can sort of hear the ideas of, as you said, of pilgrimage, but also of sort of novelty and grace and gift, and also sustenance and permanence, all tied up in the image of the ocean as sort of where we come from and where we live. Yeah, that's cool. That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Bishop Katharine, for giving us this time. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you for your questions, for your participation, and for being part of this event here, and also those of you who are live streaming. Appreciate the time that you've been with us. Thank you.
Great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.